Now that we've looked at SOHCAHTOA, I want to talk to you guys about the inverse of sine and inverse of cosine. Now, these are also sometimes known as arc cosine and arc sine. It's the same thing. What the inverse actually is just that -1. So arc cosine really equals cosine -1. Arc sine equals the same thing as sine -1. And with this, we've already looked at this a little bit in working with how do you find missing angle measures. We know that we have to use the inverse. Okay, so the only thing I'm really going to look at here that might be a little bit different is I'm going to be looking at the graphs in terms of the sine function and the inverse of the sine function, the cosine function and the inverse of cosine. So let's look at cosine first. With inverse cosine, we're looking at a regular, if I'm looking, this is 1, this is -1. So if I have the regular graph of cosine, and this is going to -2 pi, and this one's going to 2 pi. Ooh, sorry, I'm off here. This would be -pi, and this would be pi. So we have a full wave there, but the whole length is 2 pi. So what the inverse actually looks like is a little bit different. With the inverse, we're actually basing this off of a reflection on y equals x. Okay, and what happens is this actually just gets rotated a little bit. And it's like it goes through and it's sideways. Okay. It's when we have our regular cosine of x, its wave is along the x-axis. Well, with the inverse of cosine, its wave is actually along the y-axis. Things get shifted around a little bit. So notice this blue here is going to be represented as our inverse cosine. We still have that 1 to -1. It's just now instead of having it on the x, it's on the y's now. But with that, we're going to talk about what is the domain, what's the range, all of that good stuff. So with the domain for our inverse here is only going to actually be from -1 to 1. Our range, however, gets switched up a little bit and now is from -∞, say right at -8. To +∞. So our range and our domain flip-flopped. Now, the inverse of sine, same type of thing happens. With my original this is my sine function, and this now just gets flip-flopped and rotated. This one's a little bit easier to see, that reflection line of y equals x, just because it matches up with it. The domain for this, again, is still -1 to 1. Range is now from -infinity to +infinity. Otherwise, we've already done this, and how to calculate that kind of stuff. You might have to switch between radian measure and degree measure. That's something that you're going to have to look at and depend on what the question is asking for. But we both, well, I shouldn't say both because there's not just two of us. We know that you just hit the second and then the sine button in order to get the inverse of sine, or the second cosine to get the inverse of cosine.